Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Marianne Kinsell from the Refrigerated Warehouse and Transport Association. Welcome to everyone online. Thanks for taking the time to be involved today to hear more about mandatory vaccination advice for employers, a hot topic at present. I'm delighted to welcome John Snedden, a partner at Shand Taylor. John is on the dispute resolution team, where he focuses on the resolution of company disputes, company litigation, employment law, defamation and sports law. Welcome, John.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Welcome, John, and thanks for sharing your expertise with us today. Before we get into the questions that the industry have given me to ask you, and would like answered, can you give me a brief overview of what's happening out there regarding mandatory vaccinations and expectations, please?
Thanks, Marianne. Yes, it's a bit of a moving feast, and it's certainly a topic that we see in media on a daily basis. As recently as yesterday, I saw the New South Wales Premier announcing the forthcoming date when restrictions in New South Wales are going to ease, and one of the pillars of her announcement is that people will be able to start moving around, but their ability to do so will be dependent upon them producing evidence of vaccination. As a general principle, my view is that in most cases, not all, an employer would be able to require their employees to be vaccinated if the circumstances of the employment environment make it reasonably necessary for the employer to do so. It's I don't like it when lawyers sit on the fence, but there will be some workplaces where it will be unnecessary or unreasonable for an employer to do so. But in this day and age, with the onset of the Delta virus and the way our economy operates and the way, well, indeed, in the way many of the industries that the attendees today operate, mandatory vaccination would be reasonable in most circumstances, depending upon a few carve-outs for particular employees. We've already seen that governments have been able to mandate that workers, healthcare workers, aged care workers, people like first responders such as police and in some states teachers must be vaccinated. That takes place because of provisions in particular pieces of legislation. For example, in Queensland, where I live, the Health Act, which permit the government to do so. We've also seen in the private sector, companies such as Qantas, Virgin, SPC announce that they are going to mandate that employees be vaccinated as well. And I think that's a product of the industries in which they operate. But as each day goes past and the ground shifts and vaccinations become more widely taken up and the public tolerance for lockdowns diminishes, I think you'll see at a more granular private sector level more and more organisations mandating vaccination for their employees and indeed in some cases for their customers and people attending their workplace. So Marianne, that's my overriding view. I'm happy to sort of expand on that as you and participants see fit, whether by way of further breakdown from me or questions, or I'll be guided by you.
Sure. You said something just then, and you said that which is reasonable. Now, there's a letter that's come across my desk from a source that, from the Prime Minister, who signed it off to say that vaccinations will not become mandatory. And that means to me, and please correct me if I'm right, that the federal government is pushing it to the states, and the states, in my opinion, are starting to push it down to the companies, because when the state says you've got an LGO And if you're a worker, and our people are essential workers, 1B priority, what if they're told you can't go to work, and they go, oh, but I have to work, I'm an essential worker. They turn up to work, and the company itself has been, I'm making the figures up, I don't know what it is, but if the government is going to fine them $100,000 for people turning up, that company has to send that person home for obvious reasons. Does that open it up for the staff member to sue the company?
Potentially, and unfortunately, yes. I mean, the situation would be a lot easier for employers in particular if the federal government would pass some legislation, even just a minor enacting piece of legislation, you know, an amendment to the Fair Work Act, for example, dealing with this issue. And there is no doubt that people are going to be sued. There's no doubt. I dare say Qantas, Virgin and or SPC will be sued because there will be people there who don't want to be vaccinated or who believe that the employer has gone too far. And you picked up on my word reasonable. That's the critical point. That and lawyers love this word reasonable, you know, because it's a rubbery one, or I should say parliaments like it. It's the parliaments that, you know, use the word repeatedly in the legislation that lawyers are required to interpret. But it's going to come down to a question of the reasonableness of the direction by the employer given the circumstances in which the direction is given. So, for example, if you have a worker who, in order to get to work, has to cross several LGAs or even stay, from one side of the city to the other, and as part of their work, let's just say they're a driver, they cross hundreds of kilometres, perhaps even state boundaries. In order to discharge their work, they're probably going to have to be vaccinated just to get from A to B. But at a more granular level, if their work puts them in a position where they are interacting with lots of people in circumstances in which it's challenging to maintain social distancing, and that therefore means that the likelihood of them contracting the virus is increased, or the likelihood of them passing it on to someone else is increased, then that makes it far more reasonable for an employer in those circumstances to mandate that they be vaccinated. The flip side to that is if, for example, you have a worker, for example, I have some employees who sit at home at their computers and they type up the dictation that I do on a daily basis, and I hit send, press a button on my computer, it's sent to them. I don't see them really from day to day. Now, it would be unreasonable for me to mandate vaccination in those circumstances. So that's what I mean when I say reasonable, and what I mean when I say it's going to be subjectively determined by reference to their occupation.
That's a good clarification, thank you. You've mentioned in recent times we've seen the companies such as Qantas and Virgin and SPC, they're implementing these mandatory vaccinations for staff. The RWTA have received some queries up front regarding mandatory vaccination for their staff on their sites and what the legal ramifications are. What prohibits an employer to require employees to undertake an anonymous vaccination survey, for instance?
If it's anonymous, there's really nothing prohibiting employers from conducting that survey, because I think it's reasonable for employers to want to do that. If it's not anonymous, you can fall foul of the Privacy Act, which is a Commonwealth Act which imposes what's called Australian privacy principles on all workplaces, or employers, if I put it that way, in relation to the collection and use of personal information, and that extends specifically to health information. So I dare say if it's going to be done anonymously, that's fine. If you are actually saying to employees, look, we'd like to know, are you vaccinated or not? An employee might object and say that's my personal information. But that objection needs to be considered and balanced against another piece of legislation which is binding upon everyone running a business, and that is what I'll loosely call workplace health and safety law. So in every state and territory in Australia, there's a piece of legislation governing workplace health and safety law. In Queensland, it's the Work Health and Safety Act, and that imposes a positive obligation on people running a business to maintain a I'm looking at the section now, so far as is reasonably practical, ensure the health and safety of workers, and it extends not just to workers but also customers and people who I would loosely call neighbours. That doesn't mean the people necessarily situated next door. It might mean the postman who visits your premises to deliver the mail. It might be mean someone who comes into contact with your truck drivers. So that's a wonderful, warm and fuzzy piece of legislation that employers will always be able to fall back into in order to justify what they believe is reasonable conduct designed to protect workplace health and safety. So if, for example, you're running, well, a cold storage facility and there are workers who are moving product around that facility, they're coming into close contact with each other when they're lifting and moving stuff around, it's impossible for them to maintain social distancing. Obviously, you can, they might be wearing masks, but that doesn't mean masks won't slip. They're not going to touch things after touching their nose. Someone could contract COVID in those circumstances. And so the employer can say, well, I'm going to mandate that people be vaccinated because I have a duty under that legislation and a common law duty of care to ensure the safety of people in this environment that I control. That would be balanced against, for example, an employee's privacy right to refuse to provide that information. And depending upon the situation, one side's going to win over the other. So I don't think I'd win that argument if I was asking the lady sitting 10 kilometres from me right now, typing up my dictation, tell me whether you've been vaccinated and, provide me with full details of that. But I think the proprietor of the cold storage facility might win that argument. And this will always be a question of balance between the employer's duty to provide a safe workplace and what I would loosely call individual human rights laws like the Privacy Act and discrimination laws. So someone might say, well, I don't want to get vaccinated because I'm Catholic and I've heard that the AstraZeneca vaccine is derived from stem cells taken from aborted fetuses in the 1970s. You might have, and so that's a religious objection. You might have someone who says, look, I can't get vaccinated. I've been told by my cardiologist it's very unwise. And you might have a person who says, I'm 18 years old, I'm trying to get vaccinated, but I can't because there's no Pfizer available for me at the moment. So if you make me, if you introduce a system that says I have to be vaccinated to come to work, you're discriminating against me. So it's always going to be a question of balance between those two criteria, and that question of balance will be determined by the industry you work in, the likelihood of exposure to the virus, the likelihood it could be passed on, the ability to maintain social distancing, and a range of other factors in that sort of mould.
That's quite the overview that you've just given is, can you make it mandatory for your staff to be vaccinated? By the sounds of that, yes, depending on the situation that you find yourself in. So it's going to be company by company, person by person. Would that sound correct to you?
That's right. That's right. Look, I think for most organisations, you can. But I'll give you the example of my workplace. So I'm sitting on a probably 700 square metre floor in an office building. We've probably got 40 people here. So on a, person per square metre basis, we've got lots of ability to socially distance. All of my partners, to my knowledge, are pro-vaccination, and we're very, very concerned about the likelihood of our staff contracting the virus, not just because we care about them, but also because if they do, it's got, quite serious ramifications for our business. We'd all have to work from home, go into lockdown for 2 weeks. We haven't mandated vaccination. We have very, very strongly encouraged it, and we have this discussion regularly. And that's because we think if we did, someone might take us on and say, well, it's not really necessary. We not many clients come to law firms anymore. We interact with our clients this way by Teams or on the telephone or by email or, FaceTiming them on our phones. So the likelihood of us mixing with other people is limited. While we're in the office, everyone wears a mask when they're moving around common areas, go to the toilets or the kitchen. But that's my industry, my profession. I think if you're running a supermarket, those people are essential workers. They're at the coalface, really. Like, they are dealing with members of the public every day. When I go to the supermarket in Queensland, not many people are masked at the moment. Everyone's using the app and washing their hands and everything. But I think it would not be unreasonable for the proprietor of a supermarket to say, we want all our staff to be vaccinated. We think it's reasonable to do so because we're concerned about them, and we're concerned at the prospect that we may be sued if someone contracts the virus from one of our employees. So yes, you're right, Marianne, it's going to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis, but I think as each day passes, we're trending more towards it being easier for employers to mandate vaccination. And I'm sure that was the advice received by Qantas and Virgin and SPC when they came out of the blocks, a month or so ago and said, we're going to mandate it.
So just on that, while we're still on Qantas, what legal framework exists in Australia to coerce employees such as the Sydney Airport staff into accepting inoculation with an experimental vaccine that exists under an EUA or the Emergency Use Authority?
That's an interesting one. So my understanding is that Qantas has simply imposed that obligation on their staff via the reasonable direction that exists in every contract of employment. I did see that question, and to my knowledge, the vaccine that all they're saying is that they have to have a vaccine, and that means it would be approved by the Therapeutic Goods Administration. So unless there's some separate vaccine which is experimental under that ECU, the acronym you mentioned, I don't know the answer. But if it is the case that they're simply saying you've got to be vaccinated, I would think Qantas would be on relatively secure grounds in terms of what the vaccination is, so long as it's been approved by the TGA.
Okay. Which legislation, again, we're on legislation, and here's another curly one for you. Which legislation are companies reliant on to enforce legislation when government's hands are tied to enforce the broader public to be vaccinated?
Well, the companies would only be able to enforce their first of all, their employees. They can do that under essentially general principles of employment law, the principles of their contract, and the Fair Work Act to a lesser extent, but to a more significant extent, the Work Health and Safety Act. So that relates to their employees. And I mentioned before employees objecting and saying you're discriminating against me. Discrimination law in Australia is at a state and federal level. So at the state level, it's largely the same, but at a state level in Queensland, it's enshrined in the Anti-Discrimination Act. And there's a section in that legislation, and I'd bet my right arm there's an equivalent section in the other anti-discrimination state-based laws around the country and certainly in the Federal Act, which says a person may do an act that is reasonably necessary to protect the health and safety of people at a place of work. So if an employer has reasonably required an employee to be vaccinated, there's that word reasonably again, so that's going to be subjective based on the industry and the workplace. If an employee says, hey, you're discriminating against me, the employer can wave around that section, which is a defence. And then if they ever go to trial, the poor judge whose job it is to get their head around, you know, who's right and who's wrong, is just going to really focus on what's reasonable, and they're going to come back to those points I mentioned. Now, Marianne, your question was about the general public, and that's an interesting point. If you're running a workplace, can you refuse to let people enter the workplace if they're not vaccinated? The same principles apply, and it's not that different to what Gladys Berejiklian was talking about yesterday. And I think we're going to see this increasingly here in Australia, where if you go to a shop, they're going to want you to produce your vaccine certificate or vaccine passport. If you go to, and certainly a restaurant or a pub. I saw on the news the other day that this is the norm in places like Paris, and I think it's going to increasingly become the norm here. And it's really going to come down to the right everyone has to refuse service to people. I can decide who comes into my home. I can decide to whom I provide a service. So I could say you're not allowed to come into this shop, this restaurant, this law firm unless you produce a vaccination certificate. That doesn't mean I won't be sued. Someone might sue me and say you're discriminating against me on the basis because I'm of a particular religious bent, which prevents me from being vaccinated. But I would then wave around Section 108 of the Anti-Discrimination Act Queensland and say, well, I'm running a workplace and I'm really concerned about my customers, my staff, and anyone who sets foot on this place, and I'm allowed to do that. So that's it in a nutshell. It's the same legislation each time. I'm going to be boring there and just keep referring to the same laws.
No, and this is what we're looking for really, is where do we refer to, what sort of things can we work upon to make sure that companies and individuals are covered. What I may do is open up to the floor, because we do have a few minutes, and I would love some people who would be interested in asking you some questions. Julianne, if you could start the ball rolling, please.
Thank you, Marianne. Could I just ask a question? If we didn't have mandatory vaccinations in the workplace, would it be reasonable then to ask for people to provide a test weekly if they're not vaccinated?
I think it would be. You've used that word reasonable again, haven't you? So it's going to be subjective. And if, for example, that might be a way around dealing with a person who says, my cardiologist has told me under no circumstances can I be vaccinated, or a person who says, my religion prohibits me from being vaccinated. I suppose the question is going to be, is a weekly test sufficient given the transmissibility of COVID and in particular Delta? I've heard that there are these, I've forgotten the acronym, some kind of test that you can sort of do on the spot, some antigen test or something.
Rapid antigen tests.
That's it, yeah. The unfortunate acronym of RAT, but that would probably be a safer way of doing it. Each time they come to work, they do a rapid antigen test, demonstrate that the test is negative, and you go, okay, you can do it. Because what is inevitable is that someone is going to say, for example, I dare say it'll be one of the airline employees because they're furthest down the line, I refuse to be vaccinated, I think the employer's then going to be in the position where they go, well, what do we do? We have to see if we can, at first instance, I'd be saying, well, what's this person's job? Can you redeploy them to an area of your workplace where they're not going to come into contact with people? 99% of the time, the answer is probably going to be no. And then someone's going to have to make the call as to whether they terminate their employment or not. And then we'll go off to trial and find out whether it's reasonable. So your question's actually a good one because that might be seen as a reasonable way around this issue.
Claire, thank you for that question. Sorry, Julianne, that was you. Claire is up next. Claire, would you like to? You can come on camera too if you want to.
Okay. Sure. So, no, well, I just wanted to ask about your view on things like religious objections, because it would probably be difficult to, because I mean, it has to be a protected attribute, doesn't it, to have the protection of the anti-discrimination law. I'm just thinking how people would actually prove that, to say that their faith actually prohibits it, unless there was an official position from their church, which I don't know that any church. I mean, I know that the Pope has told people to get vaccinated, but that's sort of limiting. That shows you, because that's my religious bent. But yeah, what do you think of that? I mean, there's a lot of these people there's these anti-vax voices that you're hearing.
Mm.
And I don't see how that can be protected just because you doubt the efficacy of vaccines, so you would have to come up with something else that actually qualifies as a protected attribute, wouldn't you?
Yes, well, it's a good point. I mean, on the question of the Pope, I read today that only AstraZeneca is derived from those
Right.
fetal cells. I think Pfizer, Moderna, etc. are not. So an objection on that basis can be addressed through another means. But I am aware, and I am aware that there are religious beliefs, certainly within Christianity, that you don't receive blood transfusions and vaccinations and sort of thing. I can't remember which faith that is. To your question, how do you get them to prove it? Oh, it's a good one. It's a good one because obviously people might just say, "Oh, I'm, I believe in the flying spaghetti monster or whatever that strange religion is, and I therefore can't take the vaccination." I think if someone professes their faith, we have to accept it. If
you terminate their employment, then they have to then commence the action against you and fund that and wear the possibility of costs.
That's right.
When they do.
If it is reasonable for you to have insisted upon it, you have that defence under the Anti-Discrimination Act or whatever the legislation is in your state. And I think it's going to be a question of, my personal view is this, that we don't choose COVID, but we all have the ability to choose our religion. And so if you choose to adhere to a particular faith, that's your fundamental right in our country, and I'll die in a ditch to protect that right. But that does not mean it should interfere with other people's rights.
Yes.
And I think that would be what I would be saying as an employer if I had no alternate occupation for that person to perform. And I would probably have to say, look, I respect your right to pursue your faith, but I'm concerned about the safety of people in our workforce. And obviously it depends on their occupation. If they're not really interacting with other people. I think that the person relying upon their religion to refuse to take the vaccine is justified. But if they're interacting with other people, they're working in a, if they're, for example, a truck driver, and truck drivers are at the forefront of, and this is not criticising them, obviously, spreading the virus at the moment just because of their occupation and because we need them. I think that mandating vaccination in those circumstances is quite justified.
Thank you.
Claire, thanks very much for asking that question. Jackie McGrath was up next.
Thanks, Marianne. Hi, John. I just had a question. You mentioned the vaccination certificate earlier. Currently, as a medical record, it's usually considered private information. So, as we know, only accessible sort of by the medical professional. Will the Privacy Act or the Health Records Act or one of those be amended to allow for that to be presented or requested by anybody, or will we be relying on another piece of legislation?
I don't know. So you probably, I hadn't thought of that, but I dare say you're right. A vaccination certificate is personal health information, which is classified as being directly under the Australian privacy principles in the Privacy Act. A person is free to produce it, and I've got it in my wallet on my iPhone. I'm happy to produce it wherever I go if requested. But if a person refuses to do so, then we come back to that basic balancing act that I mentioned earlier, and that is that does their right to withhold that personal information trump my right as an employer to discharge my duty to protect the people in my workplace? And it's always going to then come back to that assessment of the situation by reference to what the occupation is and the risk of exposure and so on. But you're right, I don't think there's any doubt that vaccination certificate is it's private information, private health information.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jackie. Claire, your hand is still up. Did you want to ask another question, or is that an old question?
Sorry, old question. Sorry, I'm not very good at Teams. So I'll just
You're doing just fine.
put my hand down. Okay.
Look, we've got a couple more minutes. Is there? Oh, Julianne's no. Julianne's gone. Is there any?
Can I ask a question?
Sorry, who's that?
Sorry, it's Julianne. Could I ask another question?
Certainly, you may.
Sorry, I'll be quick. And Marianne, this might not be the right forum, but is it possible to ask a quick question if anybody is successfully undertaking the rapid antigen testing at the moment?
I can put you in contact with a company that is doing quite a lot of that after the meeting, if you like.
Thank you.
No worries.
I haven't counted anybody, Julianne.
I can say, Julianne, that I mean, I'm not actually going to the site at the moment because I'm in lockdown in Sydney, but because we're in Western Sydney, there were public health orders that were introduced that stated that employees either had to have one dose of the vaccination or do rapid antigen testing. So we were all geared up to do rapid antigen testing, and then the public health order was amended. So we don't actually have to do it anymore. I don't know if it is being used, because if we do have employees going to our site who do not live in an LGA of concern in New South Wales, then we could still use it. But the thing is, most of our employees live in LGAs of concern anyway. Like they actually mostly live in the LGA where our operation is based. So I believe at this stage we've bought it, but we're not actually using it. But so Marianne would be more helpful because she's actually able to put you in contact with someone who's using it.
Look, we've got a little bit of time left. We've got two more questions. I'll go for Despina first and Graham second. Despina, can I get you to go ahead?
Yeah, thank you. So what I wanted to ask, and I came late, so I'm sorry if you have already discussed this, but if, let's say, a company does want to impose 100% vaccination rule, what can we do if someone refuses to take it? Like if they turn around and say, well, I'm not going to take it. And what can that employee do? Like, say, if I was the employee who didn't want to take it, like, what are my rights as an employee and what are my rights as an employer? And also, what are the sections in the Anti-Discrimination Act that protect the employer and the ones that protect the employee? Because I just want to be prepared for both sides.
Sure. Okay. So if an employee, let's just say, I'll answer the question on the assumption that the employer's direction to take the vaccine is what looks reasonable. And if the employee says, first of all, I'm not taking that, I just don't want to take it, all right?
Yeah.
They don't give a reason other than that. I guess ultimately the end game there may be that the employer terminates their employment. The employee could sue for unfair dismissal, or they might sue a general protections claim saying, I exercise my workplace right to refuse to take a vaccination, and it'll go off to the Fair Work Commission, and it'll all come down to, was the employer's direction reasonable? And that's going to be determined by reference to what the occupation is, what the risk of exposure to the virus is, the risk of transmission, all those subjective factors based upon what industry you're in and what the employee does. If the employee's refusal is based upon a ground in an attribute in anti-discrimination law, so in Queensland in the Anti-Discrimination Act, then let's just say they say, you're discriminating against me because I have a health condition and I can't be vaccinated, or you're discriminating against me because my religious beliefs prevent me from being vaccinated. Again, the employer should consider that. And I think all these, I'll just go back a step. If you're going to implement this, you should go through a process of consultation with your workers as well, because that's the reasonable thing to do. But if the employee sues you on that basis, they can sue you either again in the Fair Work Commission, and the same determination will be made by the Fair Work Commissioner, or they could sue you in the Human Rights Commission at a state or federal level. And it's going to come down to the reasonableness of the direction. But in the, for example, the Anti-Discrimination Commission, there's two sections that you could rely upon. So section 107 says a person may do an act that's reasonably necessary to protect public health. So if I'm running a supermarket, I can impose an I would say I can impose an obligation on my employees to be vaccinated, and if they say you're discriminating against me because of my religious beliefs prevent me from being vaccinated, I'll say I'm doing that because it's reasonably necessary to protect public health. I'm relying on section 107 of the Anti-Discrimination Act. I could also rely on section 108 that says a person may do an act that's reasonably necessary to protect the health and safety of people at a place of work. So there's an abundance of legal issues at play. For the employer, it's really always going to come down to health and safety. If you think it's going to protect the health and safety of your workers, you do have some defences there. I'm not saying you're going to win because of those defences. You're going to win if the court looks at the defences and looks at your conduct and determines that you have issued what's called a reasonable direction to your employees under the circumstances of the case.
So what does that look like, the reasonable direction? Is it just the OHS committee needs to be consulted? Does it need to be a vote? What's in practical terms?
Direction, Despina, is going to be determined by, it could be that if I walk out and say to my employees right now, look, you're all coming into contact with members of the public. I'm making it a requirement of you working here that you be vaccinated. All right, so that's the direction. Whether it's reasonable or not will be determined by examining the circumstances in which it's issued. If I make that direction to the employee who's sitting at home, working remotely every day of the week, typing my dictation, that's probably not reasonable because they're not coming into contact with co-workers or anyone else in the workplace. So the reasonableness will be determined by the circumstances. There's no set form of words or process to go through to determine reasonableness. Obviously, though, if you operate a large organisation and you're thinking of doing this, you need to have meetings with your Workplace Health and Safety Committee, Board of Directors, etc. And it helps if you have documented the thought processes behind the decision that you make, so that if someone sues you, you can front before the Commission, annex the board minutes, the minutes of the Workplace Health and Safety Committee to an affidavit and say, Your Honour, we didn't do this capriciously. This wasn't something we just woke up and did. We looked very carefully at this and we thought this was reasonable for the following reasons. And you'll see that we looked at it carefully because I've annexed to this affidavit copies of all the board minutes and what have you. It doesn't guarantee you that you're going to win, but it means it goes some way towards you demonstrating that your direction was reasonable.
And Despina, thank you for your question. I'm going to need to move on to Graham's query. This will go.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. And we'll put this on and we'll get John's details to everyone. So if you've got further questions, you can go straight to him. So Graham, could I ask you to ask your question, please?
I was merely going to make a comment, Marianne, that Woolworths have introduced rapid antigen testing on all their DC sites.
Have they? Was that a question as have they done that?
No, I was merely going to pass that information on, that they have introduced rapid antigen testing in all their DCs. It's progressively being rolled out starting next week.
Okay. No, thank you for that.
Sorry?
Woolworths.
Oh, great. Okay.
Yeah. Okay, look, because we're running a little short of time and I didn't want it going on for too long, I wanted to thank you very much, John, for your insights today and for everyone joining us today and for taking part. It's always a pleasure. And we will, as I mentioned, we'll get John's details out to everyone. So if you've got more queries, you can go straight to him. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, John.
Thanks, my pleasure. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.